Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss here with our final recap video of the ecology unit. Today is Friday, September 25th, and I want to just go over a little bit about what we talked about in class. Friday afternoon, I'm going to go over this a little quickly. This isn't homework, but it presents kind of the aggregation, the culmination of all of the different kind of terminology and concepts that we have been learning in the ecology unit, and sort of puts it together into one real life case study, why this stuff is actually useful. So I'm going to go over here and show in Notability the assignment that we worked on today. So this is it's not an assignment, it's the in-class practice number 8. And what today's work was a real life case study about Flathead Lake in Montana. And Flathead Lake is here in northwestern Montana. It's a gorgeous lake with a pretty robust ecosystem, or had a very robust ecosystem. And this is the story of fishery managers, recreational managers in Montana in the early 80s, trying to increase the salmon population. And like I said, this is a real life case. And I found a couple articles about this, this kind of collapse, this mismanage of this beautiful ecosystem. One from the Los Angeles Times and the other from a local magazine or newspaper that's more local to the Flathead area. So from a research article, I've recreated the food web in Flathead Lake with phytoplankton at the bottom. The producers, phytoplankton, are plant-like producers in many lake and ocean ecosystems. Phytoplankton are generally fed upon by zooplankton, slightly larger herbivore organisms. And then fish and other things eat the zooplankton, and then there are other fish, birds, and bears that feed off of the fish that eat the zooplankton. And so these cladocarans and copepods, I think I'm saying that right, I've only ever read those words, I know are collectively known, are part of the zooplankton family. So the first thing we did is we took this food web and put it and built it into a food pyramid. And this is sort of practice for some of the concepts that we've learned already. It's not critical to understanding this particular ecosystem, but we wanted to practice this. And so we created this trophic pyramid with producers on the bottom, our primary consumers at the next level, our secondary consumers above that, and finally, our tertiary consumers are these apex predators here, the trout, the eagles, and the grizzlies. So that was more of a practice and just kind of getting a sense of like, this is the hierarchy of this ecosystem. The main question we started getting into was, okay, if you were these recreational managers in Montana, what would you have done to increase the salmon population? That was the goal that these managers had in mind, was what would I do to increase the salmon population? And students offered a number of different answers, reduce predators, sure, right? But probably hunting bald eagles and grizzlies isn't really the answer they were looking for, because they wanted to keep the biodiversity. You could more fish out the trout, but they probably wanted actually more trout. They wanted more salmon and more trout to promote fishing. So maybe the predator level wasn't what exactly they were hoping to do. So some students then said, well, I would increase the phytoplankton. And they were thinking that you increase the phytoplankton, which would increase the zooplankton, which would increase the food source for the salmon. And we talked about, yeah, that might actually have worked. And you can do that by pumping nitrogen and phosphorus into the lake because those are sort of the limiting elements for the growth of phytoplankton. You're probably going to sacrifice water clarity if you do that, if you increase the phytoplankton population. And maybe these fishery managers were thinking, gosh, that's one of the hallmarks, the trademarks of this lake, is that it's so clear and it's got all these great fish. So they took a different approach. What these fishery managers did was they introduced a shrimp, this opossum shrimp, into the ecosystem, thinking that it could become a food source for the salmon. Salmon would boom, lake trout, eagles, grizzlies, everything's going to boom here. And in fact, they did this because another lake that had introduced shrimp in order to increase the trout population saw a huge increase in salmon population. And they thought, well, it worked there, why wouldn't it work here? One thing to note is that in this particular lake, salmon are not native to this lake, actually. Salmon were introduced in the 1920s, and now this is the late 70s, early 80s, and we're trying to increase the salmon population for fishing purposes. So they introduced the shrimp, and then we said, okay, we're going to look at actual data and see what happened. Did this work? And so here we take a look at this graph, which is actually from a research paper about this particular case. And we can see along the x-axis here is the year. We're getting kind of used to seeing this in the ecology graphs. And then up along the y-axis here is abundance or population. And they didn't split the axes like we've seen in some of the other graphs we've looked at in this unit. Instead, they did this cool thing in the key where they said, whatever number you get over here from these bar graphs, if it's salmon, multiply by 1,000. If it's eagles, multiply by 7. And so 1980 is the example we used in class, where the open bars here are the salmon. So it was 50, but times 1,000, we can see there was about 50,000 salmon in 1980. And similarly, the eagles are about 50 here. So we would multiply that by 7 and see there's about 350 eagles. And the next year, 1981, is the year that the shrimp were introduced. And the shrimp follow this line right here, and each dot represents the shrimp population at that particular year. And the line is just connecting those together so we can see an overall trend. And kind of like the graph we looked at Graph of the Day yesterday, we can see it took a little while for the shrimp population to kind of catch hold. But once they did, they increased dramatically. And while the shrimp population increased dramatically, we can see behind that the predator population, which is the salmon, and then the eagles for the salmon, lag behind. We can see their population goes way down. So the shrimp got in there, their population went way up. We were expecting that this would be great for the salmon. Why was it terrible, right? Why did the salmon and eagle population go down? And this whole ecosystem, the bears left, even the trout population went down. It basically collapsed this entire ecosystem. So why is that? Well, it turns out that these shrimp eat the zooplankton. So they were competing with salmon for the same food source. Yet the salmon weren't really able somehow to eat these shrimp. And here's what ended up happening. These shrimp feed on the zooplankton at night. So they would go around, feed on the zooplankton, and then during the day, the shrimp fall to the bottom of the lake, and they kind of blend in with the bottom surface of the lake. Well, these kokanee salmon hunt during the day. So they would come out during the day, and they use their sight to find their prey. And they would look for the shrimp, couldn't find them. And in fact, there was now less zooplankton even to eat because the shrimp were eating all the zooplankton. So the salmon couldn't find any food. They would go away, and at night, the shrimp would come back up, eat more zooplankton, and fall back down as the shrimp were coming back out. So they were never in the same place at the same time. So the shrimp were getting out, the shrimp were out competing salmon for the zooplankton, and were not becoming a source of food in any real measure for the salmon. Well, it turns out, well, why did this work in this other lake, right? This all started because these fisher managers had seen in this other lake that it worked. Well, in that other lake, the contours of the lake were different, such that there was a really shallow area of the lake that kind of the wind sort of blew organisms into that shallow area. So in that particular lake, when the shrimp would feed on the zooplankton and fall to the bottom, they would get sort of pushed by the current, the wind blowing various organisms, the kind of the current into the shallower area. And when the salmon came out during the day, they would go right to that area and have like sort of a feeding buffet of shrimp. So we thought that was really interesting because the very beginning of this ecology unit, we talked about how an ecosystem is the interaction of the biotic, the living, and the abiotic, the non-living features of an environment. And this is a perfect example of how the abiotic, the contours, the topography of the bottom of this lake interacted with the biotic, the living features of this ecosystem to have very different outcomes in two different environments. In addition, it shows how the introduction of a non-native species can have unintended and sort of ripple effects across the entire ecosystem. So this sort of brought together a couple of the things that we had been talking about, or all of the things really that we had been talking about in this unit into one particular case study. So it was something that I think is really interesting to see this in real life, that the things we're learning about in ecology class actually have real life implications. And my hope from this unit was that the students, you all, take with it some skills, some vocabulary, and some thoughts where you can now ask questions. If this is being proposed in a lake, an environment that you care about, and some new intervention, new introduction, or new removal of species is being suggested, you have some tools to be able to ask the right questions and say, hey, is this going to be good for the ecosystem? What might be the other implications? And I think that's a really important skill to have. And I hope that's my hope that something of that came away from this unit. So last recap of the ecology unit, test is Wednesday, September 30th. And from there, we're moving on to the cells unit. And I will see you all there. All right, have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.